Hi, my name is Madison Sissel. As an intern for the League of Women Voters of Lexington, I'm conducting this interview as part of my work for the League's Oral History Project. Today is Friday, April 22nd, and it is my great honor and pleasure to interview Jean. I meant to ask you earlier, it's Sabharwal,
Yes,
Jean Sabharwal here in Lexington, Kentucky using Zoom. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jean.
my pleasure.
I want to ask, before I ask you about your background and family origins, we're over 2 years into the pandemic now. So I'm just wanting to see how you're doing and what has your life looked like, these past 2 years and, your participation in the community and with the league as well.
Well, over the past 2 years, I've been on numerous Zoom meetings, occasionally with league involvement. I mean, mostly just the annual meetings and occasionally meetings when the topic under discussion caught my interest. But I'm more involved in other issues, especially revolving around poverty and families and children. And so more of my Zoom meetings have been with a subcommittee of the Pritchard Committee called Strong Start and First Five Lexington and an assortment of other organizations that I'm involved with.
Could you describe what those organizations do, like what their mission is and what other organizations you're involved in?
Well, First Five Lexington is a collaboration of a number of different organizations, including PNC Bank and Kentucky Educational Television, Fayette County Public Schools, an assortment of other people who are interested in early childhood. And the idea is that all children in Lexington during those first 5 years have the best possible start. And one of those, one of the activities has been imagination libraries at doctors' offices and community places, and making sure that the books are donated or that funding is acquired. Over the years, we've had sometimes public service announcements that were little vignettes of appropriate parenting activities during grocery shopping or interactions in parks, things that parents can point out to children and count together, whether they're sorting laundry or buying groceries. It's just the idea that parents can be the best that they can be, and that it's not all that complicated. There are lots of small things that parents can do to engage with their children. And the Strong Start Committee, that is a subcommittee. The Pritchard Committee is a statewide organization that's very, very involved in education from basically from birth through post-secondary. And have been more involved in a group called the Strong Start, which is, again, basically children preschool through about third grade, making sure that the resources are available statewide in the classrooms. So the children start off as strong as they can be. Also marginally available with or involved with the Women's Network, which is more of a democratic political organization. Can't think what else, but just seems like I'm on Zoom quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm pretty busy.
I'm in 3 book clubs, and so a lot of those book clubs have been meeting online over the last couple of years too.
Yeah. Are you part of the League Book Club?
No, I'm not part of the League Book Club. Have been in another book club for maybe 20 years, and then the WEKU, the NPR station that comes out of Eastern Kentucky University. The books that they were reading caught my interest. So that's once a month. I've been joining on their Zoom calls. And then recently, over the semester, I've been participating in a Zoom book club that is organized through the OLLI program, the Older Living and Learning Continuous Learning. It's a program through the University of Kentucky.
Oh,
and
nice.
it's part of a national organization. There's OLLI programs in a lot of university campuses. And we've been reading books that have all been written by African-American women and then discussing them.
Nice. Anything else you're involved with that you want to mention before we move on?
Well, I'd really like to travel, so I've been, participating in some Zoom meetings related to planning future travel. I have visited 70 countries, and
Wow.
I'm 80 years old, so or almost on my next birthday. So I'm not sure how many more countries I'm going to get to with the pandemic or, getting over COVID, but I would like to visit 5 more countries. And my goal was 75.
Where are you at with planning those? Like, what countries are you hoping to go to, or what do you have plans for?
Well, possibly a summer trip to Morocco and Portugal. But that kind of depends on my son and my grandson. My grandson may be coaching a sailing team in Portugal for 3 weeks in July. So that's kind of up in the air. And then my major goal is to visit Central America, Panama, Guatemala, Costa Rica. And I'm not sure how soon I'll feel safe doing that.
Yeah. Well, could you please, it seems arbitrary now, but state and spell your name for me?
Yes. Jean is Jean. Sabharwal is Sabharwal.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1942.
And could you tell me about your parents?
Well, my mother was a teacher. She was partially deaf herself, and she taught at the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf. And my father was a mechanical engineer. He served during World War II in the Navy, and he was exposed to asbestos. And so he had a death at 67 related to his exposure to asbestos and caused by cancer. But he was kind of a Renaissance man. He was a good cook. He was an opera singer. He sang in a number of choirs, and he was, a good dad.
Did your mom teach you sign language?
No, my mother didn't believe in sign language. She believed in lip reading.
Okay.
And she was we had 5 children, and sometimes she would bring a couple of children from the school. It was a boarding school. And sometimes during vacations, all the children couldn't go back home and the dormitories would close. So occasionally she would bring a couple of the children to spend like a weekend or a few days at our house. And I kind of thought she was kind of on the mean side, because the children were communicating with each other with sign language, and she would sort of grab their chins and make them lip read. And, I guess that made them more acceptable in the outside world. But
Yeah.
I felt that that sign language was perfectly fine.
Yeah. And were they both born in Pennsylvania?
Yes, they were.
Okay. Do you know when your family arrived to the US and from where?
Well, actually, my father was descended from John Barry, who was the father of the American Navy.
Oh, wow.
And so he had been, and he had originally come from Ireland. John Barry didn't have any children himself, but his sister, Mary Barry, was the one that was a great, 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 multiple great aunt.
Okay.
And my mother's family actually was a mixture of German and Welsh and Irish.
Gotcha. And did you say you were one of 5 siblings?
Yes, I was the oldest of 5.
Okay. Tell me about your siblings.
Well, I have a brother who's 13 months younger, and he is living about 3/4 of the year in the Philippines. He worked for Swiss Credit for a number of years, and after he retired, one of his projects had been he'd been involved in selling a nickel plant that was located in the Philippines to a Japanese country, Japanese company, and he thought that was a bad idea. So when he retired, he went back to the Philippines and convinced the government that they shouldn't be selling the nickel plant. And he and a friend of his started a kind of a finance company in the Philippines. He had his doctorate in finance, and he still lives there and works on projects, a lot of projects with the Philippine government and also with private businesses. And he's, almost 79 years old, but he's still pretty active.
Great.
The number 3 person was my sister, who was a kindergarten teacher for many years in the school district of Philadelphia. And then the 4th one, his name is John Barry, after our distant relative. And he was an attorney for the city of Philadelphia. And then the youngest is still working, and she is a social worker who works mostly with the elderly.
Gotcha. And do you have children yourself?
I have 2 sons. One lives in San Francisco and the other one lives in Miami.
And what communities have you lived in your lifetime?
Well, basically, I've lived in Lexington, Kentucky. Well, I grew up in Philadelphia, lived for a short period of time in Bloomington, Indiana, when my husband was doing a postdoctoral fellowship there. And then we moved into Lexington, Kentucky in 1966. And I was sure that I wouldn't be here more than a year because it felt very uncomfortable when we first came. My husband is from India originally. And when we first came to Lexington, we couldn't eat in a restaurant in 1966. I mean,
Wow.
we could enter the restaurant, but they didn't serve us. And we quickly discovered a woman by the name of Harriet Van Meter, who was the founder of the International Book Project, which is still a very active organization in Lexington.
Mm-hmm.
And Harriet Van Meter had a potluck supper at her house on Sunday nights for members of the international community. So that became our social life in Lexington, and we had potluck dinner at her house almost every Sunday night.
Yeah. Could you speak more about the racism you encountered and segregation, I guess, if that was happening in Bloomington and Pennsylvania as well, but also, more about Lexington in the 60s?
Well, I didn't feel any sense of segregation in Philadelphia. I mean, my mother was a Cub Scout leader, and she had a couple of African-American kids who lived in our mixed neighborhood in my brother Barry's Cub Scout pack. And, they would come to our house for Cub Scout meetings. I had a friend in the neighborhood whose father was a dentist, who was African-American. She went to the same high school that I went to for a couple of years. She didn't finish there. My father sang in a choir that was a mixed race choir. And in Bloomington, Indiana, there were many international students. We never encountered any issues. We, went everywhere, anywhere that we wanted to, and never had any problem with being served. I did for 1 year teach in a school in Bedford, Indiana. And the first day of the school, when the principal was introducing faculty, I had signed a contract with the Bedford Community Schools as Jean Davis. And I think I had done that like in June or July, and then I got married in August, a couple of weeks before school started. So I was kind of shocked though when she made an announcement at the first meeting of all the teachers that, thank goodness, our school has escaped having any African-American students. And so I went to the office to register my changed name. And at the first meeting of parents, it was like a parent meeting, and staff were invited to bring their families if they wanted to. It was maybe in early October. I had my husband come to Bedford, Indiana. And after that, I felt like the principal really was out to get me.
Wow. And then moving here, when did you feel like you were finally accepted in the Lexington community?
Well, Lexington was just beginning to change at that time. IBM was moving into Lexington, and I think that made a big difference because there were people who were coming in from around the country, and they were bringing different kinds of expectations. When we first arrived, I felt like Lexington was a very closed community, and it was really through the University of Kentucky Women's Club that I met. We joined something called the Gourmet, I think it was the Gourmet Dinner Club or something, and we once a month we went to different houses and people planned different menus, and there was a diversified group of women and men who had come to Lexington from around the country and maybe around the world in that group. And that was how I met Carolyn Bakdayan, who was the one who founded the Women's Neighborly Organization.
Okay.
And she was from Connecticut, but her husband was from the Philippines. And meeting her made a big difference in how I thought that I could become involved in Lexington.
Yeah. So what made you and your husband decide to stay in Lexington? Since it seems like you came in thinking you were only going to live here for a year.
Well, I think as we made friends and we saw, he saw research opportunities for himself. He, got some grants and got some, attracted some graduate students and had a laboratory going. So as he became more involved in his work and I became more involved in the community, Lexington became more acceptable to me.
And he was working at UK, I'm assuming?
Yes, he was a biology professor at UK.
Gotcha. And so how do you feel like these different communities you've lived in have impacted your political beliefs or political activity?
Well, I'm not sure that it was more the people that I associated with that influenced my politics and my community I mean, I would say the Women's Neighborly Organization was a very key piece of my development as an advocate for children and families, and also made me very comfortable. Opportunities that I had through the Women's Neighborly Organization, I made contacts in city government, the housing authority, government agencies, basically helping families solve problems that seemed very, very complicated to them, but were really quite easy to solve.
Mhm. So you feel like it gave you like a good foundation to kind of build on?
Yes.
And do you feel like your involvement with the league has been at all impacted by your parents and your upbringing?
Well, I'm sure it has been. Although, I mean, my parents weren't really involved in politics, but they were involved they were part of a community. And, one of the goals of the league, I'm sure, although I'm not absolutely sure, is to, make our country a more livable place with, more opportunities for individuals, and I mean, through voting rights. And I've not really been such a serious participant in the league that I know all the expectations, actually.
That's all right. Do you have any family members that are also league members?
No, I do not.
Okay. And how did you meet your husband?
We met at the University of Pittsburgh.
Okay. I'll ask you more about college in just a little bit. Could you just tell me your experience generally growing up in Philadelphia?
Well, I would say, I mean, probably my biggest influence there was the Girl Scouts. I was really active in the Girl Scouts, and I looked forward to summer camp. We would, I went to Camp Indian Run basically for 2 weeks from as early as I can remember, probably from the time I was about 9 years old or so. And then I became like an assistant scout leader, and had my first paid job there, as a summer counselor. Well, that was a big part of my growing up. But also a place called Ocean City, New Jersey was a big part of my growing up too. We always rented a house for a couple of weeks or a month, or eventually for the summer. And then my parents bought a house in Ocean City, New Jersey, which is still in our family.
Wow.
And so summers in Ocean City, New Jersey, are part of summers and part of the summer and Girl Scout camp. Those are my best memories of growing up in Philadelphia.
And where did you go to school? Did you attend public school?
I attended a private school.
Okay. For elementary through high school?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What was your experience?
Well, I guess I had opportunities to excel and to be a leader, and made deep connections with women. Some of them I still see once a year when I have Thanksgiving in Philadelphia. About 8 of us get together for a luncheon the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, and we've been doing that for many years. I mean, and even though I don't have much in common with these women anymore, we do have that common bond that we were in school together.
Was it an all-girls school?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember having career aspirations when you were growing up, like what you wanted to be?
Well, I kind of had the feeling that there weren't that many opportunities for women.
Mhm.
There was, I think probably one of the big influences in my life, however, was the anthropologist who lived next door to me.
Okay.
His daughter was my best friend. She went to a different school, but we, saw each other almost every afternoon at 3:30 or so. And I spent a lot of time at their house. And he was an anthropologist, and he traveled to Greece and Africa and different places, and he would bring us back little souvenirs from places. And they also had a continuous flow of international visitors. He taught at the Jefferson Hospital Medical School in Philadelphia, and then went on to be the head of the anthropology collection at the Smithsonian. And I would say that family, they had 3 children and they lived right next door to us, was, they were really a major influence. And his wife, Peggy, she was very much interested in how children learned and in early childhood, and had graduated from Bank Street, which was a teacher training school in New York City. And she would talk about learning this at Bank Street and that at Bank Street. And he would bring, like a pig's heart home, and we would try to put water in the artery. And so I think they were a major influence in my life.
Gotcha. And would your parents share their political beliefs with you? What were their political beliefs?
Well, they voted Democratic, but let me just hang that up. They didn't really talk much about politics. I mean, my father once in a while would complain about this governor or that president, but they weren't all that much interested.
Okay. So as far as their political engagement went, not much past voting.
Not past voting, yes.
Would they ever mention campaigns they were interested in, or, presidents they approved or disapproved of?
I don't remember my mother ever saying anything about any political candidate or showing any interest or involvement in even, sort of caring beyond, I think, just voting straight Democrat.
Okay. Do you remember when your father was voicing his opinions of these political leaders, who exactly he was talking about and what he was saying?
Well, I mean, typically he would come home about 5 minutes to 6 every night, like clockwork. And he would read the newspaper for about 20 minutes or so, expecting the dinner would be on the table by about 6:15 or 6:20. And so sometimes he would come to the dinner table with, some complaint or some expression of distaste or whatever. It was never usually a compliment. It was always some complaint about something he had read in the newspaper just a few minutes earlier about this politician or that politician.
Gotcha. Do you remember your parents taking you to vote, or remember them voting?
No, I don't remember them voting at all. I don't even remember when I first registered to vote.
Okay.
So I probably registered, when I was 18, but I don't remember that.
And yeah. Oh, did your family life have an impact on your political beliefs?
I think only that, our home was open to people of all economic levels and social classes. And so I just always felt like everybody should have the right to gather with like-minded people, or with people who, I mean, it didn't matter whether you were like-minded or not, just, that everybody was welcome.
Yeah. And do you remember like political events that your parents would tell you about, like did you say that your father had a military background? Would he ever talk
He
about,
was in the Navy.
yeah, would he ever tell you about his time in the service?
He really didn't talk about it. He may have talked about it more with my brothers, but I don't remember any, dinner table conversations or him talking much about the Navy, maybe beyond, sort of food deprivations during World War II and how things were rationed. But nothing, about the military aspect of it.
Gotcha. And would they ever talk about the Depression?
They talked about food rationing, and they had my mother and her sisters had a victory garden during World War II, and they would talk about what they had raised in the victory garden. And the victory garden was a couple blocks from where we lived, and during probably by the time I was about 10 years old or so, there was an apartment complex that came up on that site.
Mm.
And my mother or my aunts would reminisce about how that was the site that they had, where, it was an open field and they'd had a victory garden there. And it's kind of sad that now it was apartments.
Yeah. Do you remember what they told you they had grown?
I don't remember.
Okay, that's all right. Moving into your, young adult life, you attended University of Pittsburgh, is that right?
Penn State
Oh, Penn State.
for 4 years, and then the University of Pittsburgh for my master's.
Oh, okay. So could you tell me first about undergrad, what years you were there?
I was at Penn State from 1960 to 64.
Okay. And what was your major? What did you get your degree in?
It was in education.
Okay. Any like elementary or just broad?
I think it was aimed at kind of middle school education.
Okay.
I student taught in like a 6th grade.
Gotcha. And what was student life like for you? Were you involved in extracurriculars?
I was involved in the Cosmopolitan Club that was, international students. And then I did a study abroad program at the University of Salamanca my junior year.
What country is that in?
Spain.
Okay. Do you feel like this interest in studying abroad and then the international student club that you're a part of was because of this influence from the anthropologist who lived next door?
Definitely.
Okay.
Mhm.
And were you politically involved while you were in college?
I remember thinking about going on the bus ride to Mississippi when students were spending their spring break going to register voters. I didn't end up doing that because for some reason, I think my parents were insisting that I come back to Philadelphia for spring break, and they didn't want me going to Mississippi. And I was trying to stay on their good graces because I think that was the year I was also applying for the study abroad program. And I'm not sure why, but they didn't like the idea. And so I didn't pursue it.
Gotcha. And what was student life like in general in the early 60s?
I just remember the campus being really cold sometimes. And, we had to walk. It was Penn State, it was a huge campus, and we had to walk distances. One of my PE classes was ice skating, and it was at a rink that was way off near the football field. And I just remember, it just seemed like that's probably one of my biggest memories. And,
Walking in cold.
walking in cold weather and, going to football games and basketball games. And they had international movies on Thursday nights, and I went to a lot of those movies. So interested in the rest of the world from a pretty early age. I mean,
And would you say that you felt like college had an impact on you politically?
I don't think so.
Okay. And then do you remember the first time you went to vote?
I really don't. Um, I'm not sure when. I mean, like everybody my age, we remember when we heard that Kennedy had been shot.
Okay.
And, that was pretty impactful because the Penn State Pittsburgh football game was a huge rivalry. And that was in Pittsburgh on Thanksgiving weekend. And my college roommate of 4 years basically was from Pittsburgh. And it was a tradition that we always went to Pittsburgh and stayed with her family and went to the Penn State Pittsburgh game. And, that was canceled. And we basically spent the weekend on the campus in our dormitory watching TV. And, that was just kind of a very, very strange time for many students to be packed in one room with one TV and pretty much glued to it all of Thanksgiving weekend.
Yeah. What else do you remember about like those big political events, either in your college years or before or even after?
Well, I was in Washington, D.C., and that would have been January of '65 when when Johnson was elected and for his inauguration. I was there. And when Clinton was inaugurated, I went to the inaugural event and the parade. And that was, well, I had heard Clinton speak. He had come to Lexington. Martha Lane Collins, who was our governor, had invited him to speak. And I don't remember what the occasion was, but it was something related to social services. It was like in a packed hall. And he was, talking about early universal preschool and, all these values that I held dear. And one of my friends started a petition. This was when he was the governor of Arkansas, and it was a couple of years before he ran for president. But somebody had started a petition saying Bill Clinton needs to be the president of the United States. And I remember that petition passing around. And, everything that came out of his mouth just seemed like perfect.
Wow.
And I had also heard Hillary speak. I used to go to the Children's Defense Fund had an annual meeting, and Hillary was a speaker several times at that. She had, Marion Wright Edelman, who was the founder of the Children's Defense Fund, when Hillary was a student, I think at Brown University, she did some kind of an internship with Marion Wright Edelman. So she was very tuned into the children's issues, child abuse and neglect, and those issues that were pretty relevant at that time and still are.
And could you tell me about going to Pittsburgh for your master's and what your master's was in?
My master's was in education. It was in curriculum. Forget what it was, curriculum and something else. But I did an internship in Rockville, Maryland with a social studies coordinator for the Montgomery County Public Schools. And as part of that, I spent some time in a classroom in Gaithersburg, Maryland, implementing a social studies curriculum, and then also spent time at the central office there. Curriculum studies, I forget the name of it. But one of the reasons I went to Rockville, Maryland was because this family that I had grown up next door to, I was very fond of the parents, and they lived, by that time they were living in Bethesda, Maryland.
Okay.
And this internship that was available was in Rockville, which was it was Montgomery County Public Schools. And living in Gaithersburg for a semester, I could go and visit them on the weekends, and spent many weekends at their house when I was renting a room at a house in Gaithersburg. So I would say they were very, influential in my development. And also, I think knowing them and the fact that they had visitors coming to their house from all over the world. I mean, it wasn't unusual for somebody from, a very Black African to be having dinner at their house, or someone from India or Nepal, they just had a steady flow of international visitors. And I think when I met my husband, I was comfortable kind of dating him because I had seen so many international visitors coming to their house.
Yeah. And it seems like that it mirrors that family that you grew up near that also had international visitors.
Well, that was the family.
Oh, sorry. I missed that.
No, they had, when I was about 16, they moved from Philadelphia to Bethesda, Maryland.
Okay. And so did you meet your husband in Maryland or in
Pittsburgh?
In Pittsburgh. How did you all meet?
We met at an international festival at the University of Pittsburgh.
Sounds fitting based on what you've told me so far about your interests. Moving into your career, once you get your master's degree, what did you do after that?
Well, I taught in Bedford, Indiana. Well, I actually finished my master's the first week in August of 65.
Okay.
I got married about a week later, and then I moved to Bloomington, Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I graduated around the 5th of August, and by the 21st of August, we were moving to Bloomington, Indiana. And I knew by June that I was going to get married in August, and we were going to move to Bloomington. So I started looking for jobs in school districts in that area. And I got a job in Bedford, Indiana, which was about 20 miles from Bloomington.
Okay.
And I taught there for just 1 year. And I was pregnant by the end of that year. And during that summer, we moved to Lexington.
Okay. And then once you moved to Lexington and had your first child, what did your career look like?
Well, I had 2 children, one in 66 and the next in 67.
Okay.
And it was in 1968 when I met Carolyn Bakdayan, who had started the Women's Neighborly Organization preschool program. And she said that it was okay to bring your child with you when you volunteered.
Yes.
Well, my older son was, by that time he was he was going to be 3 years old, and he was going to be eligible for the University of Kentucky preschool program.
Oh, okay.
So then I would still have a child who would be 2 years old. And she said, oh, it was fine to bring him as long as he could do some of the activities. So I started as an assistant teacher, bringing him, I think, 2 days a week to Bluegrass Aspendale, which was, the housing project at the end of 6th Street. And it was there that, I started participating. I met Madge Lynn, who later, was the one who started the Decorator Showcase, and various other people who were instrumental in expanding the program. Carolyn had started with one preschool program the year before. And by the second year, this was the second year of the Women's Neighborly Organization, there were at least, I think there were 3 preschool programs at the YMCA and Bluegrass Aspendale and the Northeast Community Center, and just lots more volunteers. People were coming out of the woodwork because, we had moved to Lexington from Michigan and Pennsylvania and other places, and we were interested in a multicultural experience. Some of us for our children, others just because we wanted to have that experience ourselves. And then I got pretty heavily involved in the Women's Neighborly Organization from 1969 until 78, when I went to work for the city of Lexington.
And what did you do when you were working for the city of Lexington?
Well, for the city of Lexington, I basically worked with the Division of Children's Services, and I started a program for teen parents. And then I also directed a child care center on Cisco Road. And I began putting together collaborations with the University of Kentucky and Cardinal Hill Hospital and Bluegrass Regional Comp Care, because the families in the division who were receiving services at the Division of Children's Services, they needed way more services than, temporary child care or day treatment for their juveniles. They needed mental health, they needed health services, they needed everything. And it was with the city that I became more involved in juvenile detention and juvenile services.
And from what years was this?
I worked for the city from 1978 until 2008 for 30 years.
Wow. And then I definitely want to ask you more about your work with the city, but what comes after 2008?
Since 2008, I've just been traveling, spending the winter in San Francisco, usually from December until March, and then summers in Ocean City, New Jersey for like 5 or 6 weeks. And then in the fall and the spring, advocating sometimes with legislators and planning activities with First 5 Lex or Pritchard Committee, or just going to meetings, planning the next trip.
You do travel a lot. You stay very busy. And so going back to your work with the city, and especially we were talking earlier about the juvenile code, could you just expand more upon what you were doing with all of your different roles? I'm really interested to hear, even with the childhood development and program for teen moms too.
Well, as I mentioned when we first started, I was talking about Scotty Kinkle. Mm-hmm. When I was with the Women's Neighborly Organization, we had 5 preschool programs that were scattered around the inner city. But we were beginning to see that the parents were looking for jobs and going back to work. And for some of them, a half-day preschool program wasn't enough. They needed a full-day childcare. So Women's Neighborly Organization, we were exploring an opportunity to open a childcare center. And I discovered that the city had bought the Carver community. Well, it was the old Carver School on Patterson Street. And they were looking at opportunities for community organizations to occupy the building. And it was going to be rent-free. So I met with Carol Wigington, who was the Commissioner of Social Services at that time, and did a presentation and, showed her what we had been doing for the last 10 years and that we were a pretty solid organization. We had some United Way funding. We had a lot of sponsors, and that we would open up a daycare center at the Carver Community Center. So she seemed enthusiastic about that. And we were allocated the front office and 2 classrooms, which then we ended up with 3 classrooms eventually. But right about the time that Carol Wigington was engaged in filling up this space, she got arrested for driving under the influence.
Okay.
And was, dismissed from her job as Commissioner of Social Services. So that was Mayor Amato at that time, and he appointed Barbara Curry as Commissioner of Social Services. And so then I had to start all over again with Barbara Curry, persuading her about, and she had been working in Frankfurt, was kind of new to Lexington.
Okay.
She didn't know, anything much about the community. So I, had to spend more time in educating her, but we were able to actually expand from 2 classrooms to 3 classrooms, and we still got the front office, which was tricky because there was another group called Micro City Government that was thinking that they were going to occupy the whole building. And Ron Burry got into trouble later on, but at that time he was running an organization that was supposedly keeping all the Black youth busy in the summertime. And they had a lot of support in the Black community. So I was competing with Ron Burry for space at the Carver Community Center. So it was a little bit of a tug of war, but we managed to keep the front office. And well, at that time, the Human Services Council and the League of Women Voters and a lot of people were interested in this juvenile. Well, they were interested in the fact that services for juveniles were not well coordinated, and this whole issue of the Clark Street jail that was, a big ugly block structure where kids were in rooms next to adults and could hear their cursing and swearing and aggression, and it was just not a good environment. And there was something called the Kentucky Unified Juvenile Code, and it needed to be revised. So a number of us were working on suggesting revisions to the code. And I especially got involved in the beginning parts where it talks about child abuse and neglect, and reporting requirements for teachers and parents and neighbors if they saw abuse and neglect. And other people have gotten more involved in the treatment of juveniles and how you treated status offenders differently than kids who had committed other crimes. And, that's really how I got involved with the League. And we, did a report, we presented it at study groups and, meetings, and added our 2 cents to the state report, and the League submitted its comments that everybody had to agree on, and it was kind of a long process. So that was kind of the first thing I did with the League. And then, some years later, I was asked to participate in, the league was looking at universal preschool. So I went to some meetings and added some comments to a report that was submitted. And then after I retired, Carol O'Reilly was working on a league study on charter schools. And the Pritchard Committee had also been working on that. And so, I don't know, she called me one day and said, somebody suggested that you might know a little bit about charter schools and that you would maybe serve on this committee. So I said, okay, and so I did some research, especially I looked at the charter schools in Philadelphia, and wrote a little report about that. And, so those are basically the 3 times that I kind of jumped in and worked with the league.
Okay. And are you able to tell me like those years? Do you know?
I mean, the juvenile code work was probably back around 77, 78, 79, 80, maybe that probably went on for 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
I have no idea when the universal preschool report was.
Okay.
And then I would say Carol O'Reilly's charter school. I really don't know. I'm just guessing around maybe 2012 or 13,
Oh, okay.
somewhere in that area.
Gotcha. So, in regards to your career, what accomplishments are you most proud of?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing that I accomplished was to create a program called the Family Care Center. In 1978, I began working for the city and began kind of pulling a lot of services together. And about 1987, Scotty Basler, who was the mayor at that time, pulled some people together. I was named director of the Division of Family Services, and he had pulled me and Barbara Curry and some other people together, and he was asking what were some big things that the city could do that would make a real big difference in our community. And one of the suggestions was the Carnegie Center to turn the vacant library building into a literacy center. And my suggestion was that we build a program around services that teen mothers and their children needed. Because as part of my program work at Children's Services, we had done a study and we had shown that we had a daycare center on Cisco Road that served only children who were referred by the cabinet for family services because of child abuse and neglect. So we looked at what were some of the common denominators in the families where child abuse and neglect was reported. Well, about 93% of those families had been started by teen mothers. Mm. So it looked to me, and none of these mothers had finished high school.
Right.
And at that time, Fayette County Public Schools, basically, if you were pregnant, you were kicked out of school. Mm. There was no opportunity to finish school. So my suggestion to Scotty was that we needed to build a program around educating teen moms, giving them a chance to get a GED or a high school diploma, at the same time providing childcare for their children and dental care, medical care, social work services. So that's what we ended up doing. He allowed us funds to build started out as a 48,000 square foot facility. And a few years later, we added an addition onto that. Um, and we had room to serve about 150 preschool children, about 40 mothers. The idea, this was also when Bill Clinton and other people were talking about welfare reform and mandating that people who were receiving what was called AFDC at that time, now it's called TANF, were participating in some sort of accountable activity when they were receiving, that you couldn't just get a grant every month, that you needed to do something. Just 1 minute, I have to go pay someone who's been mowing my grass.
I'll pause it.
Yeah, I'm ready now.
So as you were saying about the kind of daycare program for and education program for teen mothers.
Right. So I was able to collaborate with the University of Kentucky Medical Center. During the planning for this facility, we had representatives from College of Dentistry, Department of Pediatrics, College of Nursing, the Bluegrass Regional Comp Care for mental health services, Cardinal Hill for rehab services, the health department, and the school district. Everybody was coming to meetings, sometimes like almost every week, as we were developing the proposal for what became the Family Care Center. And it was just really exciting to have all these agencies saying, yes, we want to do something. And the idea was that this would be a way of following these families through the healthcare. If they started with infants as teen moms, and the children could be educated in the child care center and receive preventive health care in the pediatric clinic, that you could follow them for 5 or 6 or 10 years and see how having these services would change lives. So in 1989, October, after about 2 years of talking and planning, we actually opened up this 48,000 square foot facility on what was then Red Mile Place, but the name has been changed. It's across from the UK Extension Office. And, moms started coming to school. And initially, a lot of the referrals were families who were already in the social services system. They were receiving services from the cabinet because they, as children, had been abused or neglected, or their children had been abused or neglected. And it was a pretty challenging population. Just getting them to school every day. Teachers were calling them up. We had buses that were making the circle, and sometimes we were going out in cars and picking them up later. And just changing addresses when you're dealing with a teen mom who maybe has been kicked out of her family home, and the next week she's sleeping in the basement of the boyfriend's aunt's house. It was a challenge just finding them and getting them to school. But we began to really have a lot of success. One of the first years we had 39 graduates.
Wow.
Who either earned a GED or a high school diploma. I think last year, even with the pandemic and mostly Zoom classes, I think they had 13 mothers who graduated. So, the program is still going. It's
right.
These 2 years have been more challenging than for a while, but the current director is doing a wonderful job. But so we opened in 1989. We participated in a grant from MDRC, Manpower Development Research Corporation, which is a really high-powered research organization. And our site was funded through the Kellogg Foundation. That was a 5-year grant, And we had a lot of success through that. There was a control group, and then a group that a group that received services and a group that didn't receive services. And we were able to show that over a 5-year period that the mothers who received those intensive services, it made a big difference. A number of them went on to community college, to CNA training, a couple of them went to Berea College. By that time, or maybe it was a few years later, Berea opened up a kind of a family living program where single mothers with children could come and stay there. And that program is still going. And we've had a number of our high school students from the Family Care Center have gone on to Berea College. In fact, one is working on the staff at Berea College still. And she went there as a 21-year-old and hasn't left. I think her daughter's about 15 or 16 now. It worked really well because they were getting dental care, medical care. And it was an opportunity for residents to get training. During the years that I was there, with the center opening from 89 to 98, we trained pediatric residents who were also triple boarded. So they were getting adult and child psychiatric training as well as pediatric training. And one of them, Alan Brenzel, is over the state Department of Mental Health now.
Wow.
It was very rewarding because we trained a lot of staff people as well as teen moms and children.
It's definitely something to be proud of. Are there other accomplishments you'd like to mention throughout your career?
I think that's really the sort of the main one. That was pretty that was pretty much what I thought about day and night.
Yeah.
It didn't leave my mind when I left. Well, I would say there was another accomplishment in 2000. We passed a pretty significant bill with services for young children under Paul Patton. And it was money, there was a tobacco settlement, and Kentucky was going to get a pretty good percentage of the tobacco settlement money. And that money is still continuing to flow into the state. And 50% of that money, I think it was 50%, maybe 40%, was going to go for activities that benefited children and families. And we had an opportunity to dream up services that would be important. And Dr. Tom Young, who was the medical director at the Family Care Center, and I co-chaired a task force that came up with the idea of the HANDS program. And the HANDS program is an intensive home visitation program from birth to 2 for mothers who don't have a network of people that they can count on or depend on. And women statewide are screened in the hospital. And one of the questions is, who would you go to for advice about your baby? And if they basically say, I don't have anyone to give me advice, then they can be suggested for the HANDS program. And the Family Care Center is one of the sites for the HANDS program. And Karen Hacker, who just retired from there, was actually with the Family Care Center from the time we opened. And then she became the program coordinator for the Family Care Center HANDS program. But that's like, it's not just at the Family Care Center, it's in 120 counties in the state.
Yeah.
And it's, in the governor's budget, it's funded through the state health departments. And so, and that has been, I think, the single most factor in the reduction of referrals for child abuse and neglect. Because when you've got somebody visiting the home on a regular basis, and that mother, whether she's a teenager or she's 45 years old, she's got somebody that she can call and ask, what do I do next?
Yeah.
You know, my baby is doing this. And so instead of being so frustrated and, you know, in bad times, sometimes hitting the baby or throwing the baby in a way that they, you know, suffer some kind of head trauma, they can call and get a solution or a suggestion.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I guess now, would you consider yourself to be retired?
Oh, yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. And it sounds like you spend a lot of time in San Francisco. So what's your tie with San Francisco?
Well, my oldest son lives there,
Oh, okay.
and my grandson is in college now, but until this year, a big part of spending the time in San Francisco was just being able to be involved in his day-to-day life and, you know, pack his school lunches. And when he was little, reading to him and falling asleep next to him. And I have two grandchildren in Lexington, and I'm close to them also.
Mm.
But, you know, it's a different relationship with somebody that you know, I was involved in his sort of day-to-day care when I was in San Francisco.
And does he go to college in California nearby, or?
He goes to Western Washington University,
Okay.
which he chose based on the fact that they had a good sailing team.
Okay.
He's very much into sailing.
So this is the one that will maybe be teaching a camp in Portugal this summer?
Right.
Okay. And how were you able to balance your league membership and involvement with your work and also having a family?
Well, I would say, you know, that my family and my work took most of my time.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, you know, I fit in the league annual meetings. I think I did go to most of the annual meetings over the years, but, you know, I can't say that my work with the league was, you know, there wasn't that much of it really, you know.
Gotcha. And before we get into the league involvement, I'm wondering just about like political events throughout adulthood. You've kind of mentioned a few, but are there any other major political events that left an impression on you?
Well, the Women's March, and, you know, I've been more involved in the wintertime in San Francisco in things like marches for equity and women's marches, or marches in support of, you know, gay rights, or pretty much when I'm in San Francisco, if there's a march going on and I feel moved to support it, I'll join it.
Gotcha. And what political events currently stick out to you?
Well, I mean, you know, when people like Hillary Clinton or Obama have been in Lexington, I didn't get, Hillary Clinton visited the Family Care Center. I didn't get to be there that day because I had already retired, and only the people who were actually working there were able to, or going to school there at the time, were able to participate in meeting with her. But I'm thrilled that she visited the Family Care Center. And at one point, Al Gore was going to visit the Family Care Center. But when the people who prepare for the visit came and visited us, we have huge big windows, and they said that there would be too much sunlight at the time that he was going to be visiting, and he wouldn't show up well on camera. It was very disappointing to me.
Yeah, that's weird.
Princess Anne visited the Family Care Center, and she came at the suggestion of Judy Patton, I mentioned Paul Patton. He was the governor when all this good stuff happened for children with the tobacco settlement money, and we were able to create the HANDS program. But his wife, Judy, she came several times to the Family Care Center and read to the children. And I think she was asked for a suggestion of where Princess Anne wanted to visit some social service type organization when she was in Kentucky. And Judy Patton mentioned the Family Care Center. So she came and visited, and that was really fun to give her a tour and talk to her.
So you were the one giving her a tour and you were able to talk with her?
Yes, for sure. Mm-hmm. But one of more than her interaction with the staff and the children, what stands out in my mind is that she wore white gloves the whole time. Mm-hmm. And she never took them off. And we had borrowed a very fancy teapot. There's a company called Alltech that's pretty big in Lexington, and Deirdre Lyons, the wife, co-founder, is a friend of mine. And so I had called her up and said, what kind of tea should we serve to Princess Anne? Deirdre's from Ireland originally, but she's up on what to serve royalty.
Yeah.
So she loaned us a very fancy teapot, and she brought, gave me a big, collection of teas, and suggested what tea we should make for Princess Anne. But Princess Anne wouldn't drink the tea.
Yeah.
But, we had a number of pretty special visitors who came and visited the Family Care Center while Paul Patton was governor. The commissioner of what was it? Human Services. The commissioner who oversaw all the social services. Her name was Viola Miller. And she was so impressed with the Family Care Center that she basically, or her assistant, Nancy Rollins, many times they would pick up a visitor at the airport who was supposed to be coming to Frankfurt, but they would take them to the Family Care Center before they went to Frankfurt to show them this is an example of kind of the best of social services in Kentucky.
That's lovely. And are you able to point to any political event in particular that you feel like maybe later predicted your involvement with the League?
I can't really.
Yeah, to me, it seems you're more, this community connection.
Yeah, I mean, it was all about Scotty Kenkel. And if I hadn't spent time sitting next to her in the office at Carver Community Center, I wouldn't have probably thought about joining the League because I already had enough on my plate.
Yeah. So we're moving into the League of Women Voters now. And my first question is, how did you get involved? And you've already mentioned it a little bit, but is there any more to that story that you'd like to add? And what year exactly is this?
That would have been 1977.
Okay. So right before you start working with the city? Yeah,
it was the year before. I was, we had acquired, Women's Neighborly Organization had acquired this office space and classroom space at the Carver Community Center. And Scotty was our volunteer treasurer of the Women's Neighborly Organization, in addition to being president of the Lexington League. And the mother of 5 children and the wife of a sociology professor. And, I visited her home a number of times, and they had a very busy, active household. I was pretty impressed that she could do all that she did. Mm. And, she was, I think, telling me that I really needed to join the League. And I think at that point, I may have been talking to her, telling her about some instances of child abuse that we were experiencing and dealing with at the Carver Daycare Center. And And she mentioned that the league was doing a study, I think, on the juvenile code. And the first part of that deals with child abuse and neglect. And, I probably said to her, oh, well, the Human Services Council is looking at that also, because for 2 or 3 years before that, I had joined something called the Human Services Council. And then Human Services Council, had a subcommittee called the Children's Services Committee. And the Children's Services Committee was looking at the juvenile code too. So it just kind of all fit together. And so then I went to a few league meetings, and I think, participated a little bit in a study group that was looking at the juvenile code.
Okay. And how active would you say you are currently?
I would say that I'm not very active. I'm going to attend the annual meeting, and I attended the annual meeting by Zoom, I think the last 2 years. And I signed on a couple of times when the speaker was somebody that would be of interest to me. But I'm not thinking about the league all the time. When I was at one of the times I was in the library in San Francisco before everything shut down, they had a whole display of the League of Women Voters. And I forget even what it was. It was something that the league was involved in San Francisco. And I think I contacted Jen Jackson and said, this would be a good idea for the Lexington League. And of course she said, well, will you head that effort? And I said, no. At that point, my husband was having a lot of health issues, and we were going back and forth to doctors, and I was fixing a special diet for him, and I was like, I can't do anything else.
That's fair. Yeah, and the annual meeting is tomorrow. So
yeah, I'm anxious to hear what Demetrius Liggins has to say.
Could you describe a typical league meeting for, late 70s, early 80s? Like, where were you all meeting? What were the issues you all were talking about?
Well, I only remember meeting in people's homes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that the issues have changed all that much. Housing was a big issue. And, I think housing has been a continuing issue because segregated housing was a big issue, early on. And then, continuing the lack of housing and the high cost of housing. And then the infill, the fact that when, people buy up homes that are deteriorating and remodel them, they charge much larger rents, and then the city comes in and appraises the house for tax purposes, and then the other houses in the neighborhood usually increase in their tax rates. And so it just makes, living in the inner city harder to afford for low-income families. And that's been a continuous issue. Beyond housing, and then for a while, childcare was an issue, and volunteers. In the area of time around 78, 80, up to that in the 60s and 70s, like when I first got involved with Women's Neighborly Organization, volunteers came out of the woodwork. I mean, we had more volunteers than we found places to put them, really. But by 78, 79, 80, women were going back to work. And there were just a lot more opportunities. And, IBM came in, and there were people that I knew got jobs at IBM. The school district was expanding. People were going to work as teachers. There were just a lot of opportunities, and it was hard to find volunteers.
And you never held any formal position in the league, did you?
No, never. Mm-mm.
And you talked about the study that I feel like brought you in, where they were interested in the juvenile code. Do you remember there being other studies that they were interested in or that you were also involved with?
I think they did a study on universal preschool,
Okay.
but I would have only contributed to that because I was pretty heavily involved in that as part of my career.
Mhm.
And I don't remember the outcome of that. I think I may have just come to a couple, maybe even one meeting in somebody's house and sort of gave them a summary of what the state of early childhood education was in the state of Kentucky and Lexington. It wasn't anything that I was really involved in.
And were you ever on any committees?
No, not really,
Okay.
except the charter school thing, with Carol O'Reilly later on.
Okay.
Um,
And I've heard other members talk about candidate forums and naturalization ceremonies. Were you ever involved with?
I attended the candidate forums on a regular basis, and I've looked at the online for this year, and I've shared them with 4 or 5 friends. And I've done that over the years. I've invited other people to go with me to the candidate forums, people that I knew didn't know one candidate from another, and I wanted to educate them. And I've submitted questions for the candidate forum, especially for the council races. So that's something I have been interested in over the years.
Nice. And you've mentioned Scotty Kinkle, and it seems like Carol O'Reilly also had an impact on you. But who else had an impact on you during this time in the league? And what members did you work with?
I mean, people whom I'm friends with otherwise.
Mhm.
I mean, Diana Cluett, and we worked on the history of the Women's Neighborly Organization together. Carolyn Holmes and I have traveled some together, and she's also interested in international affairs, so we've joined forces on that. A friend of Carolyn Backdian was a league member
Okay.
back in, she's the one that started the Women's Neighborly Organization. A close friend of Scotty Kinkle, who's now in an assisted living facility, Charlotte Ziroff. I don't know if her name has come up. She was active in the league. I knew all these people, but and our paths crossed, probably socially and maybe at candidate forums or movies at the Kentucky Theater. Lexington, is kind of a small town within a certain circle.
It is. And how would you say your own interests impacted your work with the league?
Well, I would say that my own interests, when they lined up with the league's interests, then I would be involved with them. And, I'm sure I've had conversations with other people who are league members about, environmental issues, about housing issues, but not in a formal league meeting.
Yeah. So my next question is, did you work on anything else that you haven't already mentioned with the league? Any other
projects? Think of anything else.
What part of the league's work would you deem as most important?
I think consensus building on issues, and then submitting studies. As I think sometimes those studies do have an influence on state representatives and senators, and you hope that they. I think Cindy Heine's lobbying efforts have probably been very effective over the years. when she was very active with the Pritchard Committee, and she made, a lot of close connections with legislators.
Mhm. And I'm interested to hear from someone who's been so active in the Lexington community, like how big of an impact do you think the league has had within Lexington?
Well, okay, I'm thinking now about two league members,
Okay.
Rita Story and Janet Golden.
Okay.
And I guess that's why I'm thinking about housing, because now I'm remembering that I did get involved in going to league meetings about housing issues when Janet Golden and Rita Story, they were doing a league study on housing.
Okay.
And Rita ended up, the city doesn't have that position anymore. Well, now they have a different kind of housing position. But for a period of time, probably in the 80s, as a result of the study that they did, the city created a housing office within the Division of Adult Services. And Rita actually worked in that position for a few years. I'm not sure how long. But out of that office came what is now the one parent family facility on Red Mile Road. And
you were
I
part of
did go to a bunch of meetings when they were doing that study.
Gotcha. And that study was with the league, or it was more independent?
They started it as a league study on housing.
Okay. Nice. What aspect of your work with the league are you most proud of?
Oh, I don't. I really can only say that probably just being a sounding board from time to time and supporting issues that the league was working on. When I was with the city, and there were, I used to attend a lot of council meetings because I would have something that was on the agenda. Sometimes there would be league members monitoring the committee meetings or the council meetings. And, if I knew that they were interested in a certain topic and they weren't at the meeting, I would let them know, like an update or what a council member maybe said about something. My work with the league has always been very informal, kind of behind the scenes, and just through personal connections with people who were league members.
So yeah, I'm not sure how you'll answer this, but is there like a finest moment that you can think of in the league while you're involved?
I really can't think of anything.
Yeah, that's fair. What powerful things have you seen the league do that could not be accomplished by just an individual?
I can't really think of anything. I'm looking back at that housing study, and that ended up in the creation of an office within city government that was focused on housing.
Yeah.
And that might not have happened without the league study and the passionate involvement of those two ladies.
And this is my last official question for you, but where would you like to see the league in the future?
Well, I would hope that they could continue to attract younger people. I know that there are younger people who are involved currently. And we 80-plus-year-olds are, not very active anymore, and I don't really have the energy and the time. But, with voter registration and, trying change rules related to people who have felonies. And I think there's things that the league is involved in that younger people might become passionate about. Gun violence, maybe.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything?
I can't really think of anything. I think I've said everything that was on my mind or
Great.
not in my mind that you've pulled out of me.
That's good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and for your contribution to this oral history project. I really appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
I'm going to stop the recording now.